Hey, welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is Mythbusting Ellis Island. My name is Charlie Taylor. I'm here at KDLA and I'll just be facilitating the webinar. I'll be getting out of the way here in just a second. A couple of housekeeping things real quick before we get started. You will be receiving a certificate of attendance for coming today. I'll be emailing those out within the next day or so. We'll also be sending out a link to an online survey about today's training. If you could take a minute and fill those out for us, they are greatly appreciated. If you have any questions, go ahead and chat those in, and our presenters will be addressing them. Also, if you have any technical issues during the training, go ahead and chat those in, and I'll do my best to get those cleared up for you. So with all that said, I'm going to hush and let our presenters take over. Catherine and Rosemary.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Panavaria. I'm the Visual and Performing Arts Library Coordinator at WKU.
And I'm Rosemary Mazzaros, Government Documents and Law Coordinator at WKU Libraries.
We are really excited to be here talking to you about Ellis Island, and I hope today we are going to bust a few myths, and by the end of it, you're going to leave convinced that Rosemary and I have the final word on this wonderful place. Before we say anything about Ellis Island, I just want to say that a lot of what we're going to say I do cover in my recently published book, Genealogy: A Practical Guide for Librarians, which just came out in March. I cover the Ellis Island issues and more in Chapter 1 of that book. Okay, we're going to start by showing you this wonderful picture by Alfred Stieglitz. This is from the early 1900s, I think 1905, 1906. He called it the steerage. Steerage was the name for the third-class ticket passengers on the ships that brought most of the people from Europe who ended up staying, and we call them immigrants. This shows the steerage passengers out in the fresh air. One of the many federal laws that was passed by our government required that the steerage passengers be allowed on deck for at least an hour a day. So you can see some of them are taking advantage over the lower left. They're doing their laundry. They got their laundry hanging up. So the rest of the time they would have been down in the lower part of the ship, kind of near where the steering mechanisms are. That's why it's called steerage. So here they are on deck. And this is where they were most likely heading. This is Ellis Island. This is a contemporary photograph from 1905 of the Ellis Island Immigration Center. Now this center operated as an immigration processing station for only 61 years. So that's myth number one about Ellis Island. It didn't, wasn't going on for hundreds of years. It wasn't even in operation all the time during that 61 years. It actually was, the first building burned. This is the second building. So yes, a lot of people did come through Ellis Island, but the majority of the immigrants that came before 1893, of course, came through different places. There are ports all over. It was Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore,
New York.
There was another one in New York, yeah, and then
New
Orleans,
San Francisco.
Then they had immigration points along the Canadian border. In Buffalo. So there were lots and lots of places for immigrants to come through. So Ellis Island was not even close to being the only one, but it was the biggest one.
Michael, make them an offer they can't refuse. That's my Godfather impression. The Godfather, actually, was something we looked at to kind of dispel the Ellis Island myth. And Charlie's going to cue up a video that is a clip from Godfather 2, which was on last night, if you saw it, on AMC. I thought it was for luck. And it shows the arrival of the young Vito Andolini, who became Vito Corleone. And this is about 4 minutes.
So just go ahead and watch the whole thing, and then we're going to come back on, tell you to close that window, and then we're going to talk about what you saw.
Okay. Go, Charlie.
Go, Charlie. Oh, skip the ad. Okay, everyone, you can switch that off. Just close that out, and let's give everybody a few seconds to do that. Seeing in the comments that everyone, a couple people seem to like Rosemary's imitation of the Godfather. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to carry on now.
Okay. All right, you saw that clip. So, what was true in that clip and what was false? That's what we're going to be talking about.
Right. So you saw in that clip Vito Andolini arriving at Ellis Island, and supposedly the official writes his name down wrong, and there's all these other things happening. You saw the medical exam. So we're going to talk about which of those things were true and which of those things were false. But first, I want to ask this big question. How do you determine the truth about the past, about the actual history? Well, you do that with evidence. You determine the truth about the past the same way you determine the truth about, say, a crime that's been committed. You have to provide evidence, a case has to be made, and a judgment then is passed. So the way that history is a created thing. You create the history by looking at the evidence from what you have. And what constitutes good evidence? I mean, in a court, criminal court, good evidence might be fingerprints or DNA samples. For genealogy and for creating history, records created at the time constitute the best evidence. Most of that's going to be paper, but this is also going to be films, photographs, audio recordings, anything like that.
And who has created the best immigration-related paper and film record collection? Well, the U.S. government.
Yay.
Yes. Look at that handsome man coming up there.
Don't forget Rosemary's our government documents and law library, and that's why she's so patriotic.
Oh, I'm a little prejudiced, I admit it. So what kind of evidence to examine? One, federal laws relating to immigrants and immigration. Laws have been passed ever since we were a republic, and they certainly covered immigration. Two, the ship manifests, those passenger lists that you see, the big books in front of the customs officials. Three, contemporary films and photographs. What was done at the time, like the Stieglitz photo. Stieglitz, excuse me.
Now we're going to be showing you examples of all of these different kinds of evidence relating to what happened at Ellis Island.
Right. And these are better sources for the truth than a movie is.
Right.
Okay. For every session of Congress, a book has been published called The Statutes at Large, continuing to this very day. And it is a record including the text of every law passed in this country. And instructions to shipping companies
These appear in the statutes at large.
And are mandated by law. Here's a quote from one of those statutes. Report a list of all passengers taken on board, including name, sex, age, and occupation. That was part of a law that was passed March 2nd, 1819. Here's another quote.
Look at a few more times. One more. There you go.
Okay, here we go. Immigrants shall be listed in convenient groups, and no list shall contain more than 30 names. This was passed March 3rd, 1893. So laws have never been halted regarding immigration. It goes on and on even till this very day.
Right. So, okay, so there's a kind of, wide range of time between those things, but in all that time and before and long after, the federal government has been passing laws connected to who can come into the country, what documentation needs to be provided. So I want you all to just keep these two laws in mind, that starting in 1819, the shipping companies bringing people to the U.S. were required to give in a list of everyone who was on board when the ship docked, and that the lists couldn't contain more than 30 names, and that the immigrants had to be grouped together by traveling party. That was a little bit later. A lot of you know this phrase. It's part of a poem by Emma Lazarus that appears at the base of the Statue of Liberty. I love the Statue of Liberty. I love Ellis Island. I love America. But I am here to tell you that one of the myths of our culture relating to this place is that our government welcomed the wretched refuse and the huddled masses. No, they didn't. They actually did not want the wretched refuse, and they told them not to come, and they sent them back when they did. So really, it was a little more complicated. What they really wanted were healthy people who could work, and I'm going to show you some evidence for that and talk about what happened to people who were determined to be that wretched refuse. Federal laws, so like Rosemary was saying, in those statutes at large, refuse entry. These people are not allowed to, they can land at Ellis Island or any of the other ports. They just can't be released into the mainland. Federal law refused entry to a lot of different groups of people, including once the Chinese, all Chinese people, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. We're not going to talk about that now. But in general, these are some of the groups that were refused entry. Known prostitutes? Nope, sorry, not wanted, even if you're wretched refuse. Avowed anarchists, they ask you this question, are you now or have you ever been an anarchist? Well, if you're stupid enough to say yes, they wouldn't let you in. Contract laborers, anyone who had signed a contract to do work in the United States was not allowed to get out of the port, basically. They had to go back home. You were allowed to come here and then find work, but you weren't allowed to sign up to do work and then come here, because that takes job opportunities away from people who already live here. One of the biggest classes of people who were refused entry, I mean just no way, you're going back home, anyone disabled in any way, whether it was, you just couldn't walk right, or you're missing any part of your body, missing a finger, missing a foot, couldn't see well, you couldn't hear, you couldn't speak, mentally disabled, you couldn't answer basic questions, do basic IQ test kind of stuff. They sent you packing. They honestly, if anyone was the wretched refuse, it would be these people. But the federal government did not want them and was not going to let them in. And they had a good reason for that, which I will explain. Also not welcome children under 16 traveling without a parent or immediate relative. It used to be
12 years old.
12, and then they increased it to 16. So I want to remind you now, what you saw in that clip, we saw a child well under 16 traveling alone with no other adults. He's being pushed around by the officials. This is where we get into what was false about the clip. Rosemary's going to talk about that in a minute. So keep in mind, children under 16 were not welcome. They weren't just turned away at the door. They actually they went to a board of inquiry, and they had to prove that they had a parent or immediate relative waiting for them. If they couldn't, they were sent back. So the reason, I told you, the reason why the federal government denied entry to all these people who really were the wretched refuse is because they would have been, they labeled these people LPC, likely to become a public charge. Now this was before there was welfare, but you let these people in, the prostitutes, you let the handicapped people in, the children, the unattended children. What you're going to do basically is put a strain on hospitals, jails, police stations, orphanages, right?
Asylums.
Exactly. You're going to basically fill them up with these people. So the federal government just absolutely refused to allow them entry. They landed at Ellis Island, and they might have stayed for a few days, but they were sent back to where they came from. Anyone in those categories I mentioned, and anyone who failed any of those medical tests that you saw, they had TB, they had a rash of some kind, they went back home, and the shipping company had to take them at their own expense. So the shipping companies were actually strongly motivated not even to sell tickets to the wretched refuse.
Okay, let's get back to the clip and see what was true that you saw in the short clip here. The barriers and the benches that you saw, yes, that was definitely present at Ellis Island. The lines, the noise, the confusion, definitely. Officials and translators, they were packed with officials and translators. Those large manifest books on the desks, yes. Tags on the clothing. You saw young Vito and other people who got off the boat, and they had their little tags on them. Medical exams. You saw even before Vito got into the line, someone was lifting his eyelids, checking for any medical problems.
Like an eye disease of any kind.
Eye disease. And then he was sent with other men into a room where he was further examined for illness and disease. You saw him also being put in detention. It wasn't quite like that. One room per person. Yeah, it was more likely a dormitory where they had, 40, 50, 60 beds per room.
You saw the guy chalk a X on his clothes. It may have been that he had something with his eyes and they had to examine him further, but they didn't explain why they put him in detention. But they certainly would have put him in detention because he was under 16 and he was traveling without an immediate relative. Yeah.
Okay. What was false? Officials mistaking someone's point of origin for the name. This would not have been done. Officials writing people's names down. They would not have had time to do that.
No, they weren't.
An unattached child being released to the U.S. mainland to fend for himself. No, that would not have happened. You saw the tag. We have a close-up of a real tag. You see that big number 5 and the small number 6. 5 was the manifest sheet number so that the customs officials knew where that person's name was. You can see that this was from the Holland America shipping line, from the steamship Rundum, from Rotterdam. And underneath in handwriting is the name of the person who had that ticket, and also the person who was responsible, the sponsor of this person, and this one happened to be Chicago. Okay. Pardon. The captain was required by federal law to deliver an accurate list of every person who had been on the ship. Nobody was forgotten. Everybody had to be accounted for.
In other words, the list was already done by the time they arrived. Remember when we said it was false that they were writing down the names? They didn't have to write down the names. They were already on the list, or should have been.
Here's a sample of what that manifest looks like. It's labeled List or Manifest of Alien Passengers for the United States. You can see that it was required by the regulations of the Secretary of Commerce and Labor of the U.S. That's before those two departments separated. There was one. And then under Act of Congress approved February 20th, 1907. So this ship, which is the SS St. Paul, sailing out of Southampton October 1st, 1910. This is list number 4S. Not exactly sure what the S stood for, but this is, if you had 4 on your tag, it was fourth list. Down here at the bottom, under that pink arrow, you see 2 names crossed out. Those people didn't land for some reason.
They weren't on the ship.
They probably were not on the ship. There's no marks other than the crossing out of their names.
So in other words, they bought tickets. Their names were on the manifest as passengers who were supposed to be on the ship, but because they didn't get on the ship, their names were crossed off, thus creating an accurate list of the people that landed.
Right. You also see those brackets. Those are identifying parties, single family or several people traveling together. So that's what the bracket stood for.
You remember that one 1893 law that said they had to be listed in convenient groups. That made it easier. This is why when the tag number corresponded to the page number of the list. So in other words, you stand in this line because your name is going to be on this list, which is in front of this guy. So that's how we know they were not taking names at Ellis Island. They weren't writing the names down when they arrived. It's the same way when you travel now. You don't give your name when you arrive. You give your name when you arrive at the airport, and then again before you go through security.
Right.
Okay.
It was a process.
I'm going to talk just real quickly about a case that is in my own family. My mother's uncle, her father's older brother, came to the U.S. at age 12 when his father was already in the United States living in Chicago. He was supposed to come over with his mother, but his mother died. So his name was Cornell Christoy. You can see him there on the top line. I've circled that he was 12. Now, the people he was with is a lady named Maria Marny and her little boy, Miklo. That's what's circled in green. It says that G''DN, I take that to mean guardian, but she was not a relative. I'm sure of that. Now, we know that these people were admitted because way over on the left, there's a circled S. I take that to mean that they were pulled aside for special inquiry because I know they did land on the list for special inquiry, which I'm going to show you next. But then the stamp that says admitted, eventually they all were admitted, but it took Cornell actually a couple weeks. He was actually held in detention at Ellis Island for a little over 14 days, so it was 2 weeks. This was the second list for this manifest, and it's the record of aliens held for special inquiry. This is the list of the people who, like Vito Andolini, got put into detention, and then their case had to go to before the board. So down there in the lower left corner, you see I've circled Cornell and Maria Marny and little Miklo. But you can kind of see that the rest of the columns don't show anything for Maria Marny. I take that to mean her husband came to meet her and she was able to be released. Remember, unattached females were possibly going to be prostitutes. So they weren't letting an unattached woman go. There had to be a man who could pick her up and pay, any fees that were due there before they would let her go. But look, Cornell does have some stuff, and the next slide is going to show you the details on that. Look at what, Look at what they wrote next to his name, LPC. Remember that? Likely to become a public charge. This is a 12-year-old kid traveling without his immediate family members. This is Vito Andolini right here. And what happened with Cornell, of course, is that eventually his father, my great-grandfather, was able to come from Chicago to get him. Now, I don't know if he was supposed to meet the ship and he was delayed. I don't know what happened. But Cornell was actually held for 2 weeks. And how I know that is on this form, there's a column over on the right. I'm just blowing it up, and it's for meals. And you can see that Cornell was fed 12 times. He was fed breakfast, and 12 times he was fed lunch, and 15 times he was fed dinner, or what I would call lunch. So he was there a little over 2 weeks before his father came to get him. If my great-grandfather had not come to get his son, there is no way they would have released Cornell into the streets of New York. There's just no way. He would have been sent back on the ship he came from, on a different ship it could have been, but at shipping company expense, he would have been sent back to Romania, where he came from.
Rosemary and Catherine, this is Charlie. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There was a question from a little bit earlier. I didn't want it to get lost. Janet asked if you could please repeat the name of the yearly published list of boat passengers that you spoke about a little bit earlier.
The yearly thing was the statutes of limitations. That was a law.
No, statutes at large.
Statutes at large.
That's were the laws. But the list of passengers, it was called a list or a manifest.
Those are just on Ancestry. There's no yearly published list. Those are we just got all those off Ancestry.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. The yearly thing was the statutes at large, and those were laws passed relating to everything, but we just pulled out a few relating to immigration. Okay, one more myth, yet another myth that I hope to banish for you all today is that the passengers coming over to America from Europe and other places were treated like cattle. They were shoved onto the boats into the steerage hold, and then they were dumped onto the shores of America. That absolutely did not happen. These people were treated like what they were, which was passengers. Okay, they purchased tickets, paying passengers. Yeah, good point. They purchased their tickets. They had rights. The federal laws governed how many, how much food they had to get,
how much water,
how much bed space they had, how many times their bathroom buckets had to be emptied. These people could afford tickets. Even a steerage ticket costs something. It costs the equivalent of about $700 or $800. Okay, so this is third class. Obviously, second and first class cost more, but that was not nothing. The wretched refuse could not afford to come to America. So even if they had tried, they wouldn't have gotten in. So in other words, the people who came to the United States as immigrants were not the losers. They were not the people who had nothing and who were, desperately starving back there in Croatia or Poland or whatever. These people had something going on. They could get some money together, $700 a piece. Probably it was cheaper for kids, but $700 roughly for an adult. So they were passengers who had to show ID, and they had to purchase their ticket. They had to get on the manifest. They had to be checked in at the port. They were not treated like cattle. So that's my other myth I wanted to bust. This is actually an advertisement from a shipping company out of Bremen, the Franz Missler company. And these shipping companies advertised aggressively. They didn't wait for Europe's wretched refuse to come crawling to them saying, please take me to America, I'll do anything. Oh no, they were going around to these little villages hawking their wares, giving out these flyers. And this one right here, I'm not going to try to read that thing in Czech, but it basically, literally, it means boat trips for entrepreneurs. What they were doing is they were selling these voyages as a way of investing in people's futures. They were saying, take a trip to America or Australia or Africa, and we will help you invest in your future. You can go to America, you can make money, and then you can come back and buy a big house and impress your friends. And that's what a lot of people did. A lot of these passengers did not stay. They did not stay and become citizens. They actually worked for a couple years, went back, maybe came back again. So the shipping companies were extremely aggressive. They were all over Europe saying, hey, wouldn't you like to go to America? We can make that easier. We can take care of it all for you right here. We'll get you your train ticket. It's like the equivalent of a travel company doing a kind of package deal.
Yeah, because not everybody lived in a port city. Some of them had to travel to other countries in order to take a ship to America. Okay, when we were examining the evidence, we came across this commencement speech from President Kennedy at Yale University in June of 1962, and we liked it very much. He said, "For the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic." So, here we go.
This is the biggest myth of all.
My family's surname was changed at Ellis Island. Have you heard that one before? It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Historians and professional genealogists know that this is a myth, but it's a persistent myth.
As all myths are.
Oh, as all myths are. We love this illustration and quote from Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. Stickiness. The elusive quality that some ideas and concepts have, they catch on and don't let go. And certainly these Ellis Island myths have their good range of stickiness attached.
And this thing about the name change is one of the stickiest myths about Ellis Island. In fact, this is an actual children's book designed to raise my blood pressure every time I look at it. I am totally in favor of writing a children's book that explores the experience of these people who came from Europe. I mean, all my 8 great-grandparents did this around the turn of the century. I really, really appreciate that. But what I don't appreciate is with the very title of the book, this author, who I hope is not listening, is promoting this idea that at Ellis Island, in the port of arrival, these people's names were somehow changed. Because as we are about to show you with the kind of final segment of our presentation, that absolutely did not happen because it could not have happened. And that's what we're going to hopefully prove. Just to kind of give you an idea of what some of the people say in chat rooms on the subject of this name change, I just gathered a few of those comments. There's quite a few more. Some of my relatives' surnames were recorded incorrectly on arrival. These are people talking in genealogy chat rooms, and they're saying that they believe this because I don't know, they heard it from family members or whatever. The assumption with that statement is that the immigrants' names were recorded, and I've already told you that that did not happen. That is false, what happened in that Godfather clip. These names were already on the manifest list because it was required from 1819 on by federal law that the names already be on a list, an accurate list of the passengers, and those be delivered to federal agents. And then when the passengers came in, their names were checked off on those lists because you know what it's called if somebody arrives at a port and their name isn't on the official list of passengers? Rosemary, what's that called?
What I would say, stowaway.
That's right. A person who is not on the list, whose name might have to be written down, is a stowaway. And in fact, as we're going to explain later, the immigration officials were not allowed to write the names down. Not only they didn't, but they weren't allowed to and actually would have gotten in trouble. So the reality is that the immigrants' names were recorded by the shipping company at the point of origin when the tickets were purchased. Okay, that's where those names got written down, and they came across the ocean with the passengers. Here's another comment. The bastards at Ellis Island decided my ancestor's last name was too Irish and changed it. I'm sure what too Irish would look like. Yeah, I don't know. Drop the O, whatever. The assumption with this comment, which I just got straight off the internet, so it's true, officials were of different ethnicities than the immigrants. In fact, the reality is quite often the officials were hired precisely because they were from these immigrant groups and could speak these languages. They were the most valuable officials because they could interact with these people and process them more efficiently.
Here's one of the translators, Fiorello Laguardia. He was an Ellis Island translator and later mayor of New York, who spoke English, Yiddish, German, French, and Italian.
Mm-hmm.
People like him were at Ellis Island to greet the new immigrants.
That's right.
And interpret. Some more comments. My family name was probably shortened from something Eastern European to something German, certainly at Ellis Island.
Because that makes so much sense, right?
Yes, it does. My great-grandfather came through, and the name was shortened and changed by the worker.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption is that immigration officials had the means and motivation to change names. In reality, they had neither. They had not the time, nor what kind of motivation.
And they weren't allowed to.
No. In the statutes at large, these are the laws passed by the U.S. government, it spelled out how exactly the immigrants were to be treated and documented, both on the boat and on shore. The officials would have been breaking the law if they had altered the officially recorded names. They would have lost their jobs.
So they had a very strong motivation to follow the federal laws about that. Okay, the key questions to ask, just in case you don't believe us yet. Motivation. Why would these immigration officials, or the workers, as one of those comments called them, why would they change these names? Why would they misunderstand these names? And also, how on earth would these officials create a permanent name change for immigrants with whom they just briefly interacted? You saw that guy, with the Vito Corleone. The Vito never saw that guy again. He's like in a room full of 1,000 people. That piece of paper that he had on in front of him was not a blank sheet of paper. It was an already filled in manifest, and the people were, and then they never saw that again. So.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you assume it's true, how would an immigrant carry away a new name? Would officials hand them a piece of paper with their new name saying, I knew your name was Waka Zazinski, but I'm changing it to Smith. I think you're going to like this a lot better. No way. That did not happen. These people knew what their name was, okay? They walked out of Ellis Island with the same name they started with. So if anyone ever, tells you the story about the 3 Lithuanian brothers, and they arrived at Ellis Island and they left with 3 different names, just call BS on that and send them a copy of our PowerPoint. Okay, Charlie, cue up the next thing, and I'm going to just introduce it really quickly. What you're going to see in this little bit of a documentary is an Ellis Island official making checks on a manifest form. You're going to see him sit down at a desk and make 3 distinct checks. He's not writing names down, he's checking. Okay, go ahead. Okay, that's the guy. He's going to sit down a minute, right there. Check, check, check. Okay, that's all. You can close that out. I just wanted to show you the checks. All right. So, everybody close that out. We're going to be moving on here. What you saw in front of them was actually big, giant pages. Manifest pages are always marked up like this, and I've drawn 4 arrows showing you 4 distinct lines of check marks. This is 4 different people did this. If it was the same person, he would have done it the same way. So that first one was probably done when these passengers arrived at the port, where that list was. So just like when you check in at the airport, they say, okay, you're here, I'm putting a little star. The second line of checks was probably done by the guy at the top of the gangplank when they got on the ship, sort of like when you check in again at security. You've got to show your ID and your ticket, right? And then you got to do it again before you actually get on the plane, right? So that's the guy who's standing at the top of the gangplank going, what's your name? Okay, I got you. Go ahead, go to your bunk, go to your area. Third line of checks, maybe that was when they checked in at Ellis Island. You know, the guy said, what's your name? Yeah, but that's because he was verifying that you were the same person that was on this list. And he knew that he was going to have everybody that was on that list because their tag matched the number that was stamped at the top of the page. That last line of text, maybe, I don't know, when they went through their medical tests. And you see at the bottom, there's some kind of signature. The captain had to sign these pages. I mean, these were federal laws dictating these. The captain was legally responsible to deliver an accurate list. And you see names have been crossed out because they did not get on the ship. They didn't show up at the port for whatever reason. So this is what a manifest page looks like. That's what was sitting in front of that guy in the clip. They had that right, but then they had stupidly, I hate to say this, but what's the guy's name who did the movie?
Oh, Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah, Francis Ford Coppola. He gets it wrong. He has them asking his name and writing it down. That's silly.
Okay, the blank manifest books were not designed by any of the shipping companies. They were designed and printed by the U.S. government with the intention of getting records, consistent records that would remain U.S. government property. There you see the clip of the customs officials behind the desks. Notice that there's writing on those books. That's not a blank page. There's one of the immigrants, you see at the foreground with a tag on his chest. And then you see a translator, most likely, sitting on the stool waiting to be of service. Okay, the officials had no authority to alter names on the manifest. Name changes had to be approved by a board of inquiry.
Right, so their name errors did occur, like somebody's name might have gotten messed up on the original manifest, yeah.
That's right. But the Board of Inquiry had to look at it.
Right.
And many names definitely were changed.
Right. We're not saying that immigrants' names weren't changed, but they themselves did it. That's right. Okay, so the bottom line is here, yes, the names were changed, but it was the immigrants themselves who did it. And I'll tell you, actually, I should have made a slide for this. It was on the citizenship application that the federal government made it easy for immigrants to change their names. They actually just asked the question, do you want to change your name? And if yes, write your new name here. And a lot of them took advantage of that. And this would have happened several years into their time here in the United States. So after several years, they could apply for citizenship. It was a kind of a complicated process. But at that time, they could themselves decide to change their names. I had several relatives who did this. And that's when those name changes occurred. They did not occur at Ellis Island or any time at any port anywhere around the time of arrival, but they did it. Now, you're probably wondering, well, okay, Francis Ford Coppola got some of it right and some of it wrong. What does the original book say? Actually, The Godfather, the book, gets it wrong about Vito Andolini being allowed to come by himself with no adults and being released into the mainland U.S. Not in 1905, that wouldn't have happened. But I'll tell you one thing that it does get right. It gets right that thing about the names. Here's what it says in the book. Look at those words in red. He changed his name to Corleone. That's right. And that's the truth about the name changes. They happened when the immigrant became a citizen, or later they could pay a court to change their name for them. So, yes, the name change did occur, even though this is fiction, just as it occurred for a lot of real people, but in reality, like it says here in the book, those people changed their names themselves. So here's the bottom line, if you were wondering if we were ever going to get to it. There is no evidence for the name was changed to the Ellis Island idea, but lots of evidence that it did not happen.
Right. Okay, this is something that can rile me. Good enough for government work. At Ellis Island, that work was done exceptionally well.
Yes, it was.
And kudos to all government workers. Yay. There we go. Salute it.
All right.
Okay.
I'm about to sing God Bless America any minute.
Yes.
So here's what, Rosemary, I want to say to you today. We're going to leave you with one thought.
Yes.
And that is,
History matters.
and if history matters, then evidence matters.
Right.
All right, that's it. Thank you very
so
much.
Questions?
All right, Charlie.
Okay, this is Charlie. Caitlin has asked a question about, are the citizenship forms records available anywhere?
Yes. It depends on where they were done. That's a complicated question, so what I'd like to do is get the email of the person who asked that, and I would like to answer that. I'll write you, 3 or 4 sentences in answer to that.
Okay, Caitlin, you don't have to type your email address in. I'll make sure that they get your email address.
So not all of them are available, and not all of them that are available are complete, and it's a very widely varying thing. Okay, any more?
Sally says, I assume there was a black market for bringing in LPCs. I imagine some name changing could have happened in the process, and the name owner just didn't want to admit the reason.
Now, there wouldn't have been any way to do the name changes at the time, because when they applied for citizenship and gave their new name, at that point, that's when they got new IDs. They got new identification papers in that name. And I would very, very much doubt that there was much of a black market for bringing in LPCs. We're talking the federal government here. These are federal officials. All of them operate. There's a whole bunch of people as part of this. At any point, any of them could take that little kid and say, hey, they weren't all on the make. I mean, honestly, Rosemary and I started doing this project because I became really concerned that these federal officials were just getting a lot of grief, for having processed these people so poorly and changed all these names. And so they were either malicious or they were careless or whatever. And you know what? They were awesome. And they did a fabulous job of processing these millions of people. And they get so much grief for it, and I really don't think those LPCs were slipping through. No, they had to have a parent or somebody had to come and get them.
Okay, and I'm seeing several people asking for the same information that Caitlin's asking. I'll make sure you all get that. I'll get your email addresses to
Sure.
Catherine. And we have a question about, what about sketchy literacy on both ends of the voyage? I guess at the starting point and the ending point with the literacy.
Whose literacy?
Vicki, are you asking about the literacy of the people who created the manifest and then the people who check people in, on each end? The officials, she says, the literacy of the officials.
The officials were literate. They were hired because they could deal with people. They had good customer service skills. They could write. They actually, the shipping agents were the first people that took names. They sold the tickets, and then they turned in all their notes to a central clerk who created those manifests. So sometimes what you get with the manifest are copying errors. Every once in a while you'll have names repeated or left off because of a copying error, because the original notes were being transferred, and then they might even make another copy, a fair copy for the captain. This actually is connects to something else that's of great interest to me, and that is the question, is it possible to get an official list of everyone who was aboard the Titanic? And the reason is, that fact is, no, you cannot have an official list, because you know where the list is that had every single last-minute correction? The accurate list that the captain was carrying is at the bottom of the ocean, okay? That list was in the captain's safe. They have recreated lists using the shipping company earlier versions of the manifest, but there were always last-minute changes. People who didn't board, people who boarded, they were added by the shipping company. So the literacy issue really doesn't come into it. The passengers didn't matter whether they were literate or not. The shipping company clerks, these were professionals. This was their job. I mean, it's like you have one job, and the officials would not have been hired if they were incompetent and stupid and mean. Anyway, sorry, that's just my opinion, I guess.
Going back to the topic of the black market for bringing in LPCs, Sally said she was talking about in Europe when people signed up on a ship, who checked that their name was accurate in the first place.
They had to provide some kind of ID. They had to have some kind of ID that verified who they were. They had to, even if it was just a kind of affidavit from a local priest or something like that, they had to carry with them a kind of almost like a letter of reference.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that they didn't all do that, and it didn't go that well. What?
Yeah, I was thinking also a baptismal certificate would have been a verification.
No, really. I mean, we're talking millions and millions and millions of people. Of course, there were going to be times when the process, that didn't work right. But we're just talking as a general rule.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be happy to say, I see everybody's interested in that citizenship. I'd be happy. You know, I do actually break down the whole entire process in my book, that one I just talked about. I go through every single document that you can get, and so, but I'd be happy to give you a kind of little summary, you know, by email. That's fine.
Sure, and I'll make sure you get those emails. We do have another question from Bree. She says she's asking about deaths when people were coming over on the ships. How would that have been recorded on the ship's manifest if somebody died en route?
They just wrote died.
Yeah. Okay. That's easy.
They crossed their name out and wrote died. Because all that the federal agents cared about was that the list be accurate of the living people who landed. So whether somebody died or not, that was kind of like the shipping company's business.
Right.
And they weren't getting involved with that. And so if someone died, really, I think they just kind of heaved them overboard.
Yeah, they had to, these voyages lasted in the beginning 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
They later, in the 20th century, had it down to like 8 or 10 days, depending on which port they were leaving from.
Yeah.
But they might have even had to send a list of all those who died on the route, en route.
Now, Vicki, your question about the manifest. Yeah, the earlier you go, the less information is on the manifest, and the more of them have been damaged and lost or were never saved to begin with. It's the ones from the time period around The Godfather that we were focusing on, because that was kind of when we were hanging it all on. The 20th century manifests are the best ones. The earlier, before that, the information gets very, very sketchy. You know, things improved as federal laws got passed about what information had to be collected.
Right. And as you know, the government ponders a law and then decides, oh, it needs more amendments. So more and more things got added to the law. They had to use the manifest books. They couldn't substitute another one. They had to have so many gallons of water and all this other stuff. Also, what you might do, because it happened to one of my ancestors, he was listed as part of the crew. So he worked his way over.
Right.
on the passenger
A
ship.
lot of men did that. A lot of young men did that. They were hired on as crew in quotation marks. They weren't actually, sailing the ship or operating the engines. What they were hired as is people who would take care of the passengers. They worked their way across by being the people who emptied the slop buckets and handed out the food and, took care of things down below in steerage. Right. The actual ship, the people who ran the ship would never have been able to manage 500 people or 400 or 500 people on the ship. So they were like the stewards, kind of like. They just took care of everything. So, yeah, I had a couple relatives who did that. They didn't allow women to do it, just men.
Right.
And I wanted to highlight Julie's comment. Her ancestors got off a pirate ship. But Caitlin had a question.
On a pirate ship.
Yeah, she's just kidding, of course.
And the thing to remember about these manifests is they don't show anybody leaving. These are for people arriving. And sometimes people were arriving that had already been in the United States or were citizens and they'd gone back to the homeland to visit or, get brides or whatever. So, you're only getting one side of the picture, as it were. We don't have the outgoing manifest. And so the general rule of thumb is the later they are, the more they have and the more accurate they are and the less messed up they are. So, anyway.
Caitlin has a question. Would there have been something on the manifest that indicated if a woman was pregnant when she got on the boat in case the child was born on the voyage?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure they would have always known it. I have never, ever seen any indication. I think here's the thing. The captain could add people to the list up until the time the ship landed. But at the time when it pulled into port, if there was any empty lines, those had to be crossed through so that the officials at Ellis Island and the other ports were not allowed to add names. But the captain could. So I doubt they indicated that. If they had a child that wasn't there, they would have just added them on, and then when they delivered the list, it would have been accurate because they did a final check. They probably, almost like doing human inventory, they went through, they asked the people their names, and if somebody said, oh, we have this baby that we did not have before, they would just add that name to the list. But once it was finalized and the captain signed it and turned it in to the government officials, nobody was allowed to change it after that except for the Board of Inquiry.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Oh, I was thinking it's interesting that when you see newborns coming over, the age they give is 0.
Yeah.
So if they haven't reached their first birthday,
they just put 0.
0.
That's how old they put them as. I don't think they really paid much attention to, the kids that much. Really, as long as the kids were with a parent, they were just, bunched together. But the manifests are accurate as far as the people's names, as a rule, because they were written down by people who spoke their language, right? So shipping company sends agents who speak Croatian to the Croatian villages and the Polish villages and the Czech villages. So that's the whole thing about The Godfather. I feel like millions of people saw this, and now that's why they have this wrong idea. I think the idea was around before, but no, I'm like, Francis Ford Coppola, ugh. Well, we're just trying to spread the gospel here. So if anyone ever says names were changed to Ellis Island, please tell them, no, weren't.
And you can point them to this presentation. It'll be
archived
on our website.
I know some people that can prove it. So we're not going to ask you all to raise your hands if you now believe us that names were not changed to Ellis Island and all those other myths, because I know you do. But if you really still think so, you better not tell us, right?
Vicky raised her hand. You changed her mind.
Well, this is fun. This is actually one of our favorite presentations that we've done. We really like this one.
Okay, this is Charlie. I'm going to wrap up with, you can download your own copy of these slides if you want to save them to your computer, refer to them in the future, share them with your colleagues. The instructions are there on the right-hand side of the screen, and the download pod is right next to the instructions. And you can feel free to contact us. I'm going to be sending out, I'll go back and see everybody who wants the citizenship forms information and send your emails to Catherine. Make sure she gets that. And you guys will be getting a certificate for attending today, worth an hour, worth one contact hour. And I think that's it. I don't see any more questions rolling in. So thank you all very much for attending today. When you're ready to exit, click the top right-hand corner of the screen. Thank you so much to Catherine and Rosemary. It was really interesting and so much fun, and we're looking forward to having you guys back again for a new topic.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thank
We'll
you.
talk to you later.
We enjoyed it.
Thank you all so much.